How's everybody doing? My name is Dr. Michael Bufano. I'm a professor with the Political Science Department here at East Tennessee State University. And I'm going to be giving a lecture today on the securitization of migration in the United States. Basically, it's a lecture on the history of migration policy, not only in America, but in other parts of the world. I'm going to be looking today at various trends in migration and how governments have adapted to those trends in terms of the policies they've adopted and what have been the successes and failures of those policies. Now, before I get started, I just want to say a couple of things as to why I'm giving this lecture currently. Part of this has to do with my activities with ETSU's Office of Community Engagement, which runs the Alternative Breaks program and is one of the major reasons why I am giving this lecture today. This program allows students at ETSU to organize academically relevant trips at different points of the year. One of those trips this semester is a one-week visit next March to New York City, where a group of 10 students will be learning about many different facets of international migration and migration policy, and they will conduct services for the migrant community. They will meet with local government officials and representatives from various NGOs and international organizations. They will have the opportunity to interact with the great diversity of people and cultures that currently inhabit the city, which is a place I still think of as home. And of course, given recent events throughout the country, I thought such a lecture is very relevant. I actually initially gave this lecture in person to a group of students, but I thought it would be a great idea to record this, put it online so that anybody else who is interested can also listen to it. Now, for those who do not know me, my name is Dr. Michael Lofano. I'm a professor with the Political Science Department here at ETSU. One of the topics in which I have published research on is on the securitization of migration and human trafficking. I've conducted fieldwork in North Africa on this topic. And it is the right time really to hold a public discussion on this issue, given recent events in the country surrounding the activities of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, otherwise known as ICE. This is not the first time that migration has become a salient political issue in the United States, and most certainly won't be the last time either. The topics of immigration and its securitization have a long history in America and other parts of the world. It is an issue that has produced political polarization across many generations. Some Americans have supported international migration and have embraced the ideology of multiculturalism, which promotes tolerance of difference and a national identity that is founded on the coexistence of many different ethnic groups. Migration, from this standpoint, is seen generally as a net positive politically, culturally, and economically. Take, for example, the famous poet Emma Lazarus, who was a Jewish European migrant that came to the United States in the late 19th century to escape persecution. She was a social movement activist that provided charitable aid to struggling migrant communities. One of her poems, called The New Colossus, is immortalized as it is found on the base of the Statue of Liberty. The statue itself has greeted migrants to New York City from all walks of life since the completion of its construction in 1884. Part of her poem reads as follows: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." While this support for multiculturalism has a long history in the United States, there sits at the other extreme an ideology that posits that America is a nation for white Europeans. This ideology views migration as a political, economic, and cultural security threat to the Republic. It frames migration as promoting internal division and a weakening of national cohesion. The more extreme variants of this ideology have promoted white racial supremacy and the barring of migrants, or at least certain types of migrants, that are viewed as undesirable from the country. One example of this discourse is found in the 1914 silent movie, The Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan, demonized African Americans and other ethnic minorities, and promoted a white nationalist discourse. Ku Klux Klan not only emerged in the late 19th century as an opponent of Reconstruction in the Jim Crow South and racial equality, but as an opponent of the very type of migration that Emma Lazarus supported. When Birth of the Nation was released in 1914, then President Woodrow Wilson, an avid supporter of migration restrictions, initially gave vocal support to the film. In reference to the movie, he stated the following: "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation. until at last there had sprung into existence the great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. Now, of course, the issue of immigration continues to be a polarizing issue. Over the last 25 years, the American government and many other states throughout the globe have enforced new public policies that have treated migration as a threat to national security. This is due in part to rapid increases in international migration that happen to coincide with salient crises, such as 9/11, the 2008 housing crash, and the COVID pandemic that created political and socioeconomic instability across developed democracies. Right-wing populist leaders such as Donald Trump of the United States, Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, and Viktor Orban of Hungary pin the blame on migration for these crises, and this helped these leaders surge in popularity. The securitization of migration, though, has not come without resistance. Multicultural activists and politicians have mobilized against these policies, forming sanctuary cities and sanctuary movements to protest to protect migrant communities. This has led to protests and even clashes with security agencies such as ICE. Across the United States, the EU, and elsewhere, publics are now polarized over this issue. Too often, arguments over migration have involved a lot of shouting, a lack of empathy, and a lack of substantive policy discussion. What is needed now more than ever is a sober discussion on the nature of international migration and securitization policies and the impacts they have on politics, the economy, and society. I believe such discussions need to rely on empiricism, the scientific method, and data. This is the purpose of this lecture. Consequently, I have three major goals that I seek to achieve by the end of it. I will provide some answers to the following questions. So firstly, what are the historical trends in terms of international migration and its securitization at both the national and the global levels? Number two, why has international migration and its securitization intensified in recent years? Thirdly, how have these trends impacted politics, the economy, and society? I won't provide all the answers to these questions, but I'll provide some, and hopefully as well provide some room for debate as well. Now, to do this, I will first need to carefully define these concepts and measure them. Let's start with international migration. Now, part of this term involves the concept migration. This simply means when people move from one place to another. We've got to get a little more specific than this, though, right? Because this discussion is really about international migration. So I'm more concerned here with this concept. It means when people move across borders. And there are also different types of international migration, each of which have their unique dynamics that are also necessary to discuss. Firstly, some types of migration are voluntary. This is when people voluntarily choose to move across borders. People might choose to move to another country to find economic and educational opportunities. They also might move to become reunited with family members. According to international law, states are under no obligation to reject or accept voluntary migrants as they are not being forced to move. Now, other types of migration are involuntary in nature. This is when people are forced to move across borders. This can be due to factors such as violent conflicts, natural disasters, or severe political repression. Under international law, states are required to protect involuntary migrants until it is safe for them to return home. Now, a person who flees their home and is seeking refuge and legal status in another country is known as an asylum seeker. Asylum seekers are far more vulnerable than voluntary migrants because these individuals are usually less prepared to travel and normally have fewer personal resources. They are thus in need of more assistance. Once this type of migrant receives asylum and gains legal status in a new country, they become what is known as a refugee. Finally, it is very important in this discussion to distinguish between formal and informal migration. Formal migration is when migrants enter a country and remain there with legal permission. They may have obtained a short-term visa to visit the country for reasons such as tourism or going to school. In other cases, they may have gained permission to live in the country for a long period of time by obtaining a work permit, which we call a green card in the United States. In some cases, such migrants become naturalized in that they obtain citizenship. In contrast, informal migration is when migrants lack a legal status. They either enter the country without legal permission or they overstayed their visa. When a migrant is informal, this puts them in a more precarious position politically, economically, and culturally. All right, now that we've gotten all that terminology out of the way, we can now start looking at the data. Let's look at the global trends in terms of international migration. As you can see, international migration has increased over the last half century. Back in 1960, approximately 1% of the world's population consisted of migrants. By 2020, that number increased to approximately 5%. In addition, the total number of migrants worldwide grew from a little over 50 million in 1960 to over 300 million in 2020. Not all countries, though, have experienced the same levels of immigration. Some countries lose more people to migration than they gain due to a process known as emigration. That's emigration with an E. This has often been referred to pejoratively as a brain drain. Other countries have gained populations through immigration. That is immigration with an I. When they travel, migrants tend to travel to places that offer them more political security, economic and educational opportunities, and the ability to reunite with family and friends. Consequently, countries that are more stable and economically developed have tended to attract more migrants. Traditional destinations for migrants have included North America, the European continent, and Australia. Migration routes consequently tend to flow from south to north and from east to west, although there are plenty of exceptions. As you can see on the map, approximately 15% of America's population consist of migrants today, which is quite typical for developed countries. We are not the only country attracting migrants. In more recent decades, some parts of the developing world have also witnessed increases in immigration. Many individuals have traveled, for example, to Arab Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to work in the oil industry and the service sector. South Africa has attracted migrants from poorer and less politically stable places such as Zimbabwe. Some countries in North Africa have attracted migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. Some of these migrants stay in North Africa while others go farther abroad. This is where I conducted my research on migration and human trafficking. While rates of migration to the United States are comparable to other developed countries, America has by far the largest total number of migrants in the world. There are currently over 50 million migrants in the United States today. This is because America also has the largest total population out of all economically developed countries. Now, despite popular perceptions, the vast majority of the migrants who come to developed countries are also voluntary migrants and are not refugees. When refugees flee a country, they tend to flee to their nearest neighbor. Most refugees never had the intent of traveling abroad permanently, and most return to their home countries when the crisis ends. Consequently, it is poor developing countries that host the most refugees. For example, most of the asylum seekers that fled the conflicts in Afghanistan ended up in neighboring Iran and Pakistan. Most of the asylum seekers that fled the recent civil war in Syria went to neighboring countries such as Turkey and Jordan. When the Rwandan genocide happened, most refugees fled to the neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo. Most asylum seekers who have fled the Ukraine have gone to neighboring Poland. While wealthier countries do provide most of the aid to international agencies and NGOs that have helped refugees survive in their new host countries, most asylum seekers do not go farther abroad to develop countries. Instead, the vast majority of migrants to the United States, the European Union, and other parts of the developed world are voluntary formal migrants who come to these parts of the world seeking economic and educational opportunities and to be reunited with family members. Now, the recent wave of migration is also not the first one in American history. America has a long history of migration. It was the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, who first inhabited the Americas. They migrated to North Africa over 10,000 years ago when they crossed the Bering Strait during the last ice age and populated both continents, both North and South America, over the ensuing millennia. The next wave of migration came from Europe, but it was not the English who settled in what would become the United States first. It was the Spanish who colonized Florida, Texas, California, and Puerto Rico from the 1500s to the 1700s. All are now, of course, part of the United States. There is a reason why so many cities in these states have Spanish names, such as San Antonio, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. They brought with them the Spanish language and Catholicism. The next set of migration is associated with the establishment of the 13 colonies from the 17th to the 18th centuries. Individuals from Northwestern Europe, mainly of English, Scottish, Scots-Irish, Dutch, and German descent, settled on the eastern shores of what would eventually become the United States. New York was actually first founded by the Dutch in 1624. It was initially called New Amsterdam before it was conquered by the English in 1664 and renamed New York after the Duke of York. Many of these Europeans came to the New World fleeing political persecution and seeking economic opportunities, which is not so different from the motivations that drive many migrants today. They also sought to spread their own versions of Protestant Christianity. There are now hundreds of versions of Protestantism in America today. In the process of this migration, most of the Native American populations were wiped out by disease and warfare. To supply the labor on newly established plantations in the southern colonies, slaves from West Africa were transported over to the New World, where they were used as slave labor. They came to consist of 10% of America's population. European waves of migration, though, did not stop from there. The French also migrated to what is now Louisiana in the Midwest, where they founded cities like New Orleans and Detroit in the 18th century. The immigration also did not stop after independence. The 19th century was a time of industrial growth in America and westward expansion. There was a demand for labor in the cities and the countryside. From the 1850s to the 1880s, millions of Irish, German, and Chinese individuals traveled to the United States. Many of them were fleeing from conflict and dire poverty. In Ireland, over 1 million people died from famine from 1845 to 1852. The country witnessed a revolution in 1848 against English colonialism. Over 1 million people fled the country seeking asylum. As a result, there are now over 30 million people of Irish descent in America today, which is 4 times more than the total number of Irishmen in Ireland, which is an incredible statistic. Prior to becoming assimilated, many of them struggled with discrimination due to their ethnic and religious background. The story does not sound so dissimilar from the story of Somalis fleeing famine and conflict today. Other waves of migrants came in the late 19th century and early 20th century from Southern and Eastern Europe, including from Greece and Italy. Most of my family members came from Southern Italy during this time period. Much of them came from the island of Sicily specifically. They were mainly poor olive farmers escaping grinding poverty and searching for economic opportunity. They came to America with big hopes and dreams for themselves and their family members. It is because of them and the sacrifices they made that I grew up in New York and gained access to a good education. I had the privilege of going to university and becoming a professor of political science. Almost all of you in this room have a similar story to tell. I should say most of you listening online have a similar story to tell. Maybe the story of your family's migration took place 200 years ago. Perhaps it was 100 years ago or 30 years ago. Maybe you yourself are a migrant seeking better opportunities. But this is the common bond that the overwhelming majority of Americans share. The current wave of migration we are seeing is just the latest wave. And this latest wave has been due to globalization. Some of these migrants have come from Latin American countries like Mexico, Salvador, and Nicaragua. Many have migrated from Caribbean countries like Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Others have come from South Asian countries like India and Pakistan, and Middle Eastern countries like Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Iran. So many of these people share similar dreams and deal with similar challenges. As you can tell from the data, the current wave of migration to America over the last few decades is only the latest in a long history of immigration. We've had two major waves of migration since independence and many previously to independence. Due to this history, America is extraordinarily diverse. While white Europeans are in the majority, they come from many different parts of Europe, and they have a diversity of religious and cultural backgrounds. They are Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Greek, and Russian Orthodox. America's non-white minorities are equally diverse and come from many different ethnic backgrounds. America, quite clearly, is not homogeneous, and it has not been homogeneous since the country was founded in 1776. Some parts of the country, though, are of course more diverse than others. It is the coastal cities in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast that have attracted a far larger number of migrants. This is especially true of New York, which has America's largest harbor and has been a magnet for migrants since the city's founding. While approximately 15% of the country now consists of migrants, approximately 37% of people in New York were born in foreign countries, a far larger percentage than states like Tennessee, where the number is 6% in comparison. If one is not aware of these statistics, one's views on how homogenous the United States is as a country very much depends on where they have lived. You can see this diversity on these maps of New York's ethnic groups. It kind of looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. The metropolitan area of the city, otherwise known as the tri-state area, is massive. It consists of over 20 million people. The city proper consists of 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and the Bronx. It is spread across 3 islands as well as parts of the mainland United States. The metropolitan area also sprawls beyond these borders to the New Jersey shore, to Connecticut and Long Island. Because of the very high demand for real estate, housing, and office space on islands like Manhattan, the city's residents have had to build up. Manhattan, as a result, is filled with large skyscrapers. This has created a massive infrastructure challenge and has led to a lot of problems with traffic. Luckily for the students going to the trip to New York with me in a few weeks, we will be spending most of our time walking around Manhattan, and taking the city's relatively cheap subway to travel around. The city's diversity is not only due to the large number of migrants currently inhabiting the city, as you can see on the chart to the left, it is also due to the long history of migration that stretches back several centuries. There are over 100 languages spoken in the city today and dozens of different ethnic groups from different parts of the world. These images reflect why so many migrants have been attracted to the city. Having the largest port in the country, New York has been able to accommodate many travelers for centuries. It has become the largest hub for trade in the United States. As the center of the city is the island of Manhattan and Wall Street, which is the wealthiest hub for financing and stock trade in the world, it has attracted many migrants. The thriving market economy created a great and still growing demand for services such as construction, retail, restaurants, and hotels, economic sectors that migrants have helped to fill. The wealth and grandeur of the city's architecture have also made it a hub for tourism, where people come to visit from all corners of the world. They come to see sites like Times Square, with its bustling crowds and diverse array of entertainment, restaurants, and nightlife. The diversity of the city has also made it a hub of artistic and intellectual creativity. New York City has some of the best universities in the world, such as NYU and Columbia. It has attracted students from a diverse array of backgrounds. New York's museums, such as the Museum of Modern Art and its theaters that line the street of Broadway, continue to serve as an attraction for tourists looking to experience live theater or a taste of New York's cultural life. New York is so jam-packed that with people and so full of life at all hours of the day that it has been nicknamed the city that never sleeps. This is what has attracted so many migrants to the city, and is what has led to the establishment of iconic ethnic neighborhoods such as Little Italy, Chinatown, Harlem, and Spanish Harlem. In these neighborhoods, ethnic groups express their pride in their rich cuisine, their cultures, their religious institutions, and their history. Yearly celebrations, such as the St. Patrick's Day Parade, are both expressions in ethnic pride, as well as expressions in pride in American identity. To be an Irish American, an Asian American, an Italian American, or an African American is not only an expression of ethnic difference, but also an expression of what we have in common. We are Americans who come from a diversity of backgrounds. It is this eclecticism that has produced cultural innovation. Harlem, for example, was the epicenter of the Harlem Renaissance, where African Americans experiment with new forms of art, literature, poetry, and music, such as jazz. This eclecticism has also led to innovations in cuisine and the emergence, according to my very biased opinion, of some of the best food in the world. Pizza, Chinese food, bagels, and gyros were some of the staple foods I grew up with. A carb nightmare for some, but a dream for others. Later in life, I learned to love Indian and Mexican cuisine. And if you ever visit New York, avoid McDonald's, Taco Bell, and Sparrows, and try to visit some of the local restaurants there that have some genuine food that come from the cultures from those different parts of the world. And just to clear up some misconceptions about these migrants, the overwhelming majority of them are here legally in the United States. Approximately half of them are citizens. Another quarter of them are here legally on long-term work visas, with most of them being green card holders or the dependent children of those who are working. If migrants on a work visa stay here for at least 5 years, have a clean criminal record, pass a citizenship test, and give an oath of allegiance, they can become citizens. Another 4% of migrants are here legally on temporary visas as refugees, on student visas, or as tourists. The rest, approximately 23%, are here informally. The majority of these individuals did not cross the border illegally, but overstayed their visas, often due to delays in the processing of visa renewals. What is true, though, is that the number of informal migrants has grown during the latest wave of migration. In 1990, there were approximately 3.5 million informal migrants in the United States, and that has risen to over 14 million as of very recently. So what explains these recent trends? What is going on? Well, a large part of this has to do with globalization. The world is becoming more interconnected in terms of trade, communication, and population movements. This is due to recent advancements in transportation, communications technology, and electronics. The emergence of the airline industry, large freight shipping, and modern ports to handle massive amounts of trade has enabled a quick and safe movement of goods and people across the world. Communications technology such as cell phones and the internet have enabled people to communicate across borders and spread information. This has enabled migrants to learn about opportunities overseas and communicate with friends and family upon traveling. Electronic banking has also enabled migrants to more easily send money back home to friends and family in the form of remittances. The growing movement of people and goods would not have been possible without the emergence of growing international cooperation and free trade agreements. Since the decline and end of the Cold War, the United States has become the world's sole superpower. The United States promoted capitalism and free trade agreements with countries across the globe. This growing intensity of trade came with the building of an infrastructure to manage that trade. This has made it easier for migrants to travel. Globalization, though, has also come with growing economic inequality across the globe. Wealthy entrepreneurs can move their businesses offshore to take advantage of cheap labor. And powerful multinational companies can more easily accumulate wealth and political influence. They can hide their money in offshore tax havens and pressure governments to decrease taxes on their profits. This growing inequality has been witnessed across countries and within countries. With growing awareness of these disparities in wealth, individuals have migrated to regions of the world where they could find better economic and educational opportunities for themselves and their family members. Part of the reason for growing migration also has to do with the emergence of international institutions that have helped refugees after World War II. The war killed over 80 million people and created millions of refugees. In the aftermath of this devastating conflict, the United Nations was created to facilitate diplomacy between countries to prevent another world war and deal with the tragic consequences of World War II, which includes helping asylum seekers. In 1948, UN member states, including America, signed the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which urges member states to uphold basic human rights and to protect asylum seekers fleeing from conflict. Member states in 1950 also created the UN Refugee Agency, known as well by its acronym, the UNHCR, to assist migrants fleeing conflict. With donations from wealthy states, the organization provides food, shelter, and clothing, as well as legal, medical, and educational services to asylum seekers, and helps them obtain refugee status in their host countries. The responsibility of states to help refugees was further solidified with other international treaties, including the 1951 Convention related to the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol. UN member states cannot, according to international law, reject asylum seekers. The results of these treaties are that far fewer civilians are being killed due to warfare in comparison with the past, but it has also increased the number of asylum seekers and refugees throughout the world. It is another cause of growing international migration. New York has taken in tens of thousands of refugees. The city is also host to the headquarters of the United Nations, which my students will be visiting during their trip. Why now is informal migration increasing? Well, most of the migration across the world has been formal. Informal migration has also been growing. Why is this the case? Part of the reason is growing rates of migration and the legal systems that have dealt with them have struggled to keep a pace with that growing migration. Many developed countries have yearly quotas in terms of the number of migrants that they allow in the country and the types of migrants they allow. These quotas generally have not kept up with the growing supply and demand for migration. Populations in developed countries are getting older, which has created a need for an influx of young labor. Globalization has also destabilized economies and has sometimes created demands for new types of labor that domestic markets cannot fill. If migration policies do not keep up with these changes, businesses are sometimes pressured to hire informal labor to meet their labor demands. This has happened extensively, for example, in America's agricultural sector. The migration policies of the United States have prioritized welcoming in skilled labor over labor in the agricultural sector in recent years, which has created labor shortages in the agricultural sector. Now, another critical reason for this, and this might be surprising for the increase in informal migration, is tied with its securitization. You cannot have informal migration unless there are legal restrictions on migration, after all. And these restrictions have grown over the last 2 decades across developed countries and in other parts of the world. So what exactly is the securitization of migration? It involves 2 major components. Firstly, migration has to be framed as a potential threat to national security. There are several reasons why migrants become framed as such a threat. Academic studies have shown that rapid increases in migration tend to lead to growing perceptions, real or imagined, among host populations that immigrants create cultural, political, and economic threats to citizens. Culturally, some citizens may feel that migrants represent a threat to their language, their religion, and other aspects of their culture. They may fear the loss of the dominance of their language or their religious traditions. According to Robert Putnam, linguistic differences between migrants and citizens can also stifle communication and decrease levels of trust within a community. This growing feeling of cultural threat can lead to expressions of hatred and xenophobia towards migrants, as well as tensions amongst migrant communities with their host populations. This growing feeling of cultural threat can thus lead to all sorts of problems. It can take a long time for migrants to assimilate as a result and to be accepted by their host communities. Migrants may also be perceived as an economic threat. They may be framed as competitors for jobs, as users of state welfare, or as causes of overpopulation and strains on local infrastructure. Such feelings can lead to frustration with migrant communities. Growing rates of migration could also lead to feelings of political insecurity. Migration changes demographics, which can lead to shifts in the balance of electoral power between different political parties over the long run. The ethnic majority may feel that they will lose their political power to new competitors. In the case of the United States, such fears have generated support for white replacement theory, which is based on the fear that white individuals are being replaced by outsiders. It is important to note that these perceptions of migrants are not always based on reality. They are as much shaped by misinformation as they are by real-world challenges. Politicians and media outlets can exacerbate these tensions between native-born citizens and migrants depending on how they frame the issue. These perceptions of migrants are often made worse by exogenous shocks or crises that lead to people scapegoating migrants for the disasters. Since the year 2000, several major exogenous shocks have led to migrants being framed as security threats. I'll discuss three major ones here. On September 11th, 2001, 16 hijackers from various parts of the Islamic world associated with the radical Islamist organization Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes with box cutters. They flew 2 of those planes into the Twin Towers in New York City and one of those planes into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Over 3,000 civilians were killed. America and its NATO allies subsequently engaged in a global war on terrorism, where the U.S. government spent over $2 trillion over the next decade, domestically and overseas. Since the hijackers were migrants, many politicians and media outlets framed immigration as a threat to national security. Academic studies have shown that 9/11 led to a rapid growth in anti-immigrant sentiments. Migrants were framed by many as terrorist threats, as well as criminal threats to citizens. Xenophobia towards Muslims and Islamic migrants from countries such as Somalia also intensified. The framing of migrants as terrorists or as criminals, though, does not match reality. The academic evidence paints a very different picture. As I will show in a second with the data, migrants in the United States are not more or less likely to commit crimes or nonviolent crimes, nor are they more likely to commit acts of terrorism. The same is true in the European Union. This has not stopped, though, media outlets from continuing to promote these claims. The second major crisis was the 2008 housing crash in the United States, which turned into a global recession. The housing crash was caused by the deregulation of banks, the large-scale issuing of risky home loans to people who could not afford to pay off those loans in the long term. In the aftermath of the stock market crash, many media outlets and politicians chose to blame the country's economic woes on migration. It is important to note that the effects of mass migration on economies are mixed, according to academics. In the short term, migration can sometimes cause economic challenges depending on the nature of the migration and the nature of the host country taking in the migrants. An influx of a large number of asylum seekers or low-skilled migrants who lack access to resources can sometimes strain the resources of local and national governments, as well as the infrastructure such as housing. The poorer the migrants and the poorer the host country, and the larger the number of the migrants that are coming, the more this can create challenges. Following the Rwandan genocide in 1994, for example, over 2 million migrants streamed into the neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country that was also suffering from high levels of poverty and political instability. This rapid migration destabilized the Congo's political system and led to a violent conflict that persists until today. Informal migration as well can sometimes lead to a drop in the average wages in communities, since such migrants working informally are often paid below minimum wage. Migration also, though, has many potential positives, both in the short and the long term. Once again, context matters. Migration is more likely to be an economic boom for a country when the migration is voluntary and well regulated. For developed countries with aging populations, migration provides a much needed boost of youthfulness in the labor force, especially since older individuals are retired, they're taking a lot of welfare benefits like healthcare. They often need an influx of young people to work and to pay for those welfare benefits through taxes. Over the long term, migration has been shown to bring economic growth to countries, which includes the United States under these contexts. The overwhelming majority of migrants who come to the United States are voluntary and legal historically, and they have contributed greatly to the country's economic growth, not to mention its cultural dynamics. Studies by economists have generally shown that migration is positive for economic development for countries over the long term. This, though, has not stopped media outlets and politicians from framing migration as a threat to economic security in developed countries. The most recent crisis of importance was the COVID pandemic. COVID shut down supply chains during the lockdown to prevent the spread of disease and had negative economic ramifications for the globe. During the crisis, many media outlets and politicians framed migrants as a threat to public health. Numerous politicians who were not in favor of the domestic lockdowns, such as Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, used the pandemic as an excuse to increase border security and keep migrants out. Once again, though, the evidence that migrants are a threat to public health is dim. When it comes to public health, Migrant communities such as asylum seekers face the most significant threats due to their socioeconomic marginalization and not the host populations. Now, because of these exogenous shocks, perceptions of migrants as threats to national security have increased across the developed world over the last 2 decades. This has led to a shift in public policy, which is the second critical aspect of the securitization of migration. These securitization policies involve an increase in the policing of migration and the restricting of migration, informal or formal, from other countries. This can involve increased investments in border security, the surveillance of migrants, and increases in the resources and facilities needed to deport migrants. It can also involve greater hurdles for people to enter the country as legal migrants. This can include higher fees for applying to obtain a visa, a more stringent vetting process that involves background research and interviews, and the reduction of quotas in terms of the migrants allowed in the country each year. While such policies can lead to more deportations of informal migrants in some cases, they could also potentially backfire depending on the context and the nature of the policies. Securitization can make it more difficult for migrants to find legal pathways to travel to a country. It can also make it more difficult for formal migrants to renew their legal status, which can lead to people overstaying their visa without a choice of their own. It could also lead to the emergence of black markets of human traffickers specialized in sneaking people across the borders. These networks can shift informal migration routes towards more dangerous paths that are also more difficult for border security forces to monitor. In some cases, securitization can make informal migration worse in terms of how it takes place. Such human trafficking networks have emerged to smuggle people into the United States from Latin America and into Europe from Africa and the Middle East. Human trafficking networks are often established by criminal syndicates that also make profits from forced labor, drug trafficking, and sex trafficking. Growing number of migrants desperate to flee conflict zones, grinding poverty and famine, but increasingly lacking in legal channels to migrate, has sometimes turned to these trafficking networks for help. In the process, millions of migrants have been exploited and have become victims of forced labor, sex trafficking, and fraud. Traveling informally across borders also brings with it various safety and health risks. Thousands of migrants, for example, have drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea to get to Europe in overcrowded boats. I had the unfortunate experience of having to listen to so many of these horrifying stories from the migrants I interviewed during my time in countries such as Tunisia and Mauritania. Let's look at some of the data to demonstrate the evidence for these findings. In this first chart, we are looking at changes in the percent of migrants in the United States across time and the violent crime rate per 100,000 people. While the number of migrants coming to the United States has increased, America's violent crime rate has actually plummeted over the last few decades. Despite media perceptions, crime is not as much of a problem today in comparison with the 1980s. Of course, correlation is not causation, but far more sophisticated studies have been conducted on this topic. Take, for example, this next set of data. In this study, the researchers compared crime rates across cities from 2007 to 2016. They analyzed the relationship between crime rates and the percentage change in the number of informal migrants per capita. They found that cities that had growing rates of informal migration actually had a slight drop in both violent and nonviolent crime during this time period, in comparison with states that saw a decrease in such migrants. This, by the way, is the decade before Trump got elected. One of the suggestions for this slight decline is that migrants have various incentives to avoid the criminal justice system. For formal migrants, a clean record is needed to obtain a citizenship. For informal migrants, getting in trouble with the law can lead to deportation. Of course, we also have to look as well at the economic claims that I just made. Take, for example, the next set of data. In this study, the researchers are looking here at the economic relationship between economics and migration. While there are a few outliers, there is a strong and positive correlation between migration and economic growth. Economists largely support migration for this reason. since it allocates labor to areas where it is scarce across the globe and depopulates areas of the world where unemployment rates are high. These academic studies and the hard data have not stopped many media outlets and politicians from framing migration as a severe threat to national security. Since 9/11, attitudes towards migrants have changed dramatically in the United States and across the developed world. Let's look at the survey data. Here we are looking at data from the survey question that measures whether respondents have negative or positive attitudes towards immigrants. It comes from Pew Research. From 1965 until the 1990s, less than 10% of Americans expressed negative attitudes towards migrants. Since 2001, these numbers have skyrocketed. By 2021, 1/3 of Americans were expressing negative attitudes towards migrants. As you can see, negative attitudes increased following various crises such as 9/11, the 2008 economic recession, and the COVID pandemic in 2020. These changing attitudes towards migrants have led to changes in voting habits and the public policies of politicians across the developed world. Take, for example, this information on the percentage of votes received by political parties in Europe that are anti-immigration. From 1962 to 2016, parties that framed themselves as an anti-immigrant grew from receiving approximately 1% of the vote to 10% of the vote, and those numbers have increased since then. In Germany, a neo-Nazi party known as the Alternative for Deutschland received 20% of the vote in the latest parliamentary election. Support for right-wing politicians has grown. Right-wing populist politicians has also grown in the United States. Donald Trump in 2016 ran on a campaign that placed a heavy emphasis on securitizing migration and framing migrants as criminal threats. In his first speech of that campaign, he stated the following: "When Mexico is sending its people, they are not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people." The rhetoric proved popular with those who have expressed anti-migrant sentiments. Donald Trump did not create these anti-immigrant sentiments. He merely took advantage of them to build his right-wing populist brand. Individuals in America who support these sentiments are more likely to be Republican, white males from the South and Midwest who lack a college education, although there is variation on attitudes towards migrants across all social groups. The majority of Trump's base of support have consistently expressed negative attitudes towards both formal and informal migrants. While 85% of Biden supporters in 2024 were for undocumented immigrants staying in the country illegally, 32% of Trump supporters are opposed to those individuals staying in the country legally. Furthermore, 46%, and by the way, what I mean by that is those informal migrants being given the chance to get their legal status. Furthermore, 46% of Trump supporters were not comfortable with people speaking a language other than English in public, while that number was 17% among Biden supporters. There are also partisan divisions over perceptions of the United States as a nation. 64% of Trump supporters do not believe that America's openness to people from all over the world is essential to who we are as a nation, whereas 87% of Biden supporters believe this. Due to growing support for the securitization of migration, governments across developed countries have increasingly invested resources into policing migration. Take the United States, for example. In 1990, approximately $200 million was spent on securitizing migration through border security and immigration law enforcement. In 2019, that number skyrocketed to $4.8 billion. Just 6 years later, the total number that is spent on all forms of migrant policy is an incredible $170 billion, more than what most countries spend on their armed forces. One of the consequences of such securitization is the growing rates of human trafficking and its victims. According to the Walk Free Foundation, the number of victims of human trafficking have doubled since the year 2000, growing to over 50 million people across the world today. The victims of human trafficking now live under various forms of modern slavery. Now, to clear up another misconception about America specifically, this is not the first wave of securitizing migration in America's history. The United States has a long history of securitizing migration that has changed across time. For approximately the first century of the country's history, there was no security-based institutions that specifically policed migration, but there were laws in place that limited who could become a citizen, which impacted migration patterns. Shortly after the writing of the Constitution, a law was passed in 1790 that limited the naturalization of citizens to those migrants who were white individuals from Northwestern Europe. This encouraged migration from this part of the world while discouraging migration from elsewhere. Various states also had racially discriminatory laws that discouraged migration by non-white individuals. Now, this only began to change in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. When the 14th Amendment was ratified to the Constitution, it made it so that all individuals born on American soil became citizens. The intent of this amendment was to give immediate citizenship to slaves after the Civil War ended. By extension, this amendment also gave citizenship to all the children of migrants born on American soil, and this has been held up by subsequent Supreme Court cases. This shift led to a rapid rise in the number of individuals migrating from non-European countries such as China. It generated a nativist response from white supremacist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. In response to the nativist backlash, the U.S. government in the late 19th century began passing racially bigoted laws that securitized migration. For example, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented individuals from China from migrating to the country. And to enforce these restrictive policies, new security-based institutions were created, such as the Federal Bureau of Immigration in 1891. It was created to enforce border migration policies. In fact, the first border guards were placed on the Mexican border in 1904 to regulate migration there. Further restrictions came in the following decades. America's participation in World War I was followed by growing support for isolationism. Furthermore, the Red Scare refers to the growing fear over the spread of communism following Russia's communist revolution in 1917, also inspired further restrictions on immigration. For example, the Immigration Act of 1924 only allowed migrants from Northwestern Europe to migrate to the country. Now, to enforce these policies, new facilities were created at ports and border crossings in different parts of the country. Different border crossings, different ports. The most famous of which was on Ellis Island in New York City's harbor in 1892. The purpose of this facility was to screen migrants seeking to enter the country to make sure they were eligible for immigration and to quarantine migrants to prevent the spread of disease. It is here that my family first stepped foot on American soil. Ironically, the facility on the island stands in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, which reflects America's conflicted history over migration. Most individuals who enter the country now do so mainly through airports and are screened at these locations. So Ellis Island is no longer used for this function. Now, this building is used as a museum dedicated to the history of migration. These restrictive migration policies remained in place until a major shift took place in the 1960s. This shift was due to the civil rights movement and the spread of multicultural discourse. From the 1950s to the 1960s, civil rights activists mobilized not only a struggle against racial segregation in the Jim Crow South, but for the right of other marginalized groups, such as women and various migrant communities, including the Hispanic community, coming from different places in Latin America. They engaged in protests and media campaigns to pressure federal, state, and local governments to dismantle racially discriminatory laws and change the country's migration policies. They finally achieved success in the mid-1960s with the Immigration Act of 1965, which was passed by the Lyndon Johnson administration. By this point in history, the Democratic Party, which was once the party of slavery and racial discrimination, had undergone a seismic shift in policy in its policy platform and was becoming the party of multiculturalism and the rights of marginalized groups. This law that was passed abolished the racial quotas of the 1920s. Consequently, the law significantly increased migration from the Asian and African continents to the United States. Furthermore, further reforms were made in the next couple of decades that increased rates of migration. For example, a new immigration law was passed in 1990. This law created the diversity visa program. It established a lottery-based system that increased migration from poorer countries. Citizens of these countries could enter their name in a lottery at the U.S. Embassy and potentially be chosen for permission to migrate. The H-1B visa was also created, which allowed U.S. employers to employ skilled migrants and sponsor their travel to the United States. The law also created a temporary protected status for asylum seekers. The United States began to take in more refugees as a result after this. Such reforms would not have been possible without civil rights activism. Movements such as the Chicano movement protested to increase the rights of the Hispanic community in the United States and to push back against cultural and racial discrimination. Many local governments in the ensuing decades instituted multicultural reforms, such as changing curriculums in schools, spending more time teaching about the history of America's diverse groups, and promoting tolerance of difference. Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, and other immigrant groups also held similar protest movements promoting reforms. While migration continued to be a politically salient issue in the United States in the ensuing decades, the debates from the 1960s to the 1990s were not usually over whether or not migrants from developing countries should be excluded. Instead, it was over whether or not migrants should be fully assimilated into American culture, or whether they should be able to preserve some aspects of their own culture. The debate was over assimilationism or multiculturalism, not whether migrants should be barred outright from the country. By 9/11, though, this discourse changed. Following the terrorist attack, migration once again became heavily securitized. In 2002, the Department of Homeland Security was created. Its mission was to prevent acts of terrorism domestically and heavily police migration to prevent another 9/11 from happening. Many older bureaucracies and some new ones are placed under the DHS's umbrella to encourage the sharing of information across bureaucracies with the intent of enhancing America's security. The bureaucracies that deal with migration were reorganized and renamed. Three major bureaucracies emerged. The first major bureaucracy was the United States Customs and Border Protection Agency. Some of its functions were similar to prior bureaucracies that handled border security. It inspects the importing of physical goods from other countries to ensure they comply with U.S. laws. They inspect and vet migrants who are crossing the border to ensure that they have legal status to enter the country. They also police land borders with Canada and Mexico. Of course, the Coast Guard continued to police the coasts. The bureaucracy, though, specifically the USB, also took on new functions that created controversy domestically. A new initiative called U.S. Visit was created, where migrants entering the country had their fingerprints taken, their photos taken, and personal information recorded, following a lengthy interview process. The purpose was to engage in the surveillance of these migrants throughout their stay in the country. The data was shared with local, state, and federal level agencies electronically. For example, if a migrant violated a crime and was arrested by a local police station, the migrant's fingerprints would immediately identify who they are and let the Department of Homeland Security know they had committed a crime. The U.S. government also kept a close watch on students coming from abroad by keeping in contact with their universities to ensure they were going to school. This represents an intensification of surveillance. Extensive racial profiling also took place. At airports, migrants from the Islamic world were more likely to be stopped for special screenings and more intensive interviews by customs agents. A new agency called the Transport Security Agency, the TSA, was also created to more thoroughly screen travelers in airports, making flying a far more pleasant experience for both U.S. citizens and migrants, although this was justified on the basis of keeping people safe. Second major agency created was the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, otherwise known by its acronym ICE. Their role was to vet visa applications coming from abroad and conduct background histories on migrants to ensure those individuals were not security threats. Because of the more extensive vetting of individuals, it now takes migrants far longer than in the past to obtain a visa. For asylum seekers, for example, the waiting period is approximately 2 years. For individuals fleeing conflict, this is a long time to wait to gain permission to enter a country. Another critical responsibility of ICE is the enforcement of immigration laws in the interior of the country. After the creation of ICE, the Department of Homeland Security began to intensify enforcement of immigration laws in the interior of the country. Along with increased funding for internal policing, ICE has used data surveillance to increase cooperation with federal, state, and local agencies. The local police department arrests and detains someone who is an informal migrant. That information has to be sent to ICE. Local officials could then decide whether or not they would detain the migrant so that ICE officials could come and arrest the suspect. Due to the federal structure of the American government, local and state officials are under no obligation to enforce federal laws. That is the job of federal agencies. However, they can choose to cooperate with agencies such as ICE if they choose to do so. Lastly, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services was created to handle migrant naturalization, the issuance of green cards, and services for refugees. They vet the application of migrants to determine whether they qualify for citizenship, work permits, and other types of visas. For all of these bureaucracies, spending increased dramatically after 9/11, increased over the following 25 years. What is important to note in regard to the Trump administration is that they did not start this renewed process of securitization. Instead, they intensified it, and in some contexts, in controversial ways. In Trump's first term, he issued over 400 executive orders, changing how ICE and other migration agencies enforced immigration law. What made the Trump administration different is they started treating informal migrants increasingly as criminals, and they increased rates of detention prior to trials. This was potentially problematic for several reasons. Firstly, most informal migrants today overstay their visa, and overstaying their visa is neither a misdemeanor, a felony. It is a civil violation that could lead to a fine and being deported. And in many cases, many of these people who overstay their visas, it's because they've had to wait longer periods to get their visas renewed because of changes to the system. Furthermore, crossing the border illegally is only considered a misdemeanor. It only becomes a felony when individuals attempt to enter illegally on multiple occasions, when they commit other crimes while crossing the border, or if they commit other types of crimes when they get caught being here informally. Prior to Trump's first term, most informal migrants who were caught and charged by authorities were not detained for long periods of time, especially those who were only committing a civil violation. They were usually released on bail, wait for a trial, and then would be deported if found guilty. And of course, since most informal migrants, as I'm going to show you, they're trying to follow the law, most actually do show up to their court dates. Those who were detained were those who were generally committed felonies. They tended to be younger men without families in the past. Trump's administration, though, began detaining migrants in larger numbers who had only committed civil violations or misdemeanors. Justification of the Trump administration was that some migrants go into hiding and evade authorities before their trials, so they needed to be detained. While this is true in that some people do fail to show up to their court dates, the problem, though, is that there's a growing number of previously legal migrants who overstayed their visas because of the increasingly lengthy time it took to renew their green cards or other visas. Every 10 years, a green card holder needs to renew their visa. Prior to 9/11, this took several months. Now it can take several years. Many law-abiding migrants found themselves in a precarious position where they struggled to adapt to an unstable political landscape where laws on migration were changing rapidly. This had several consequences. A growing number of older migrants with families were detained, and children found themselves separated from their parents while waiting through long periods of detention. As the number of detainees rose, facilities became overcrowded, which created what many international human rights observers saw as dehumanizing conditions for migrant detainees. The Trump administration has also made other changes. They drastically reduced the pathways to legal migration by reducing migrant quotas and access to green cards. They also intensified racial profiling. A travel ban, for example, was issued on 7 Muslim countries. The Trump administration also made other changes. Sorry about that. So let me move on to this next slide here, actually. What was the result of these securitization policies since 9/11? At first, deportations escalated under the Bush and Obama administrations. However, they started to decrease in the second half of Obama's run as president for several reasons, the most important of which is the number of illegal crossings started to decline. Securitization made illegal entry more difficult. As you can see, Trump's coming into office in his first term actually only led to a slight increase in deportations, despite a very significant increase in spending on ICE during his first term to try to identify and deport migrants. Those numbers then plummeted during the COVID pandemic when traffic declined, both formal and informal traffic declined to the United States, although they picked up rapidly once the pandemic came to an end. The number of informal migrants who are in the country as a result of border crossings has actually declined in recent years. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what has changed then? Why are the number of informal migrants growing? Well, let me explain. There's a few reasons for this. First, let's just look at what has actually changed under the Trump administration. What has changed is the number of migrants who are detained in facilities while they wait for trials. In 1990, there were less than 10,000 migrants detained. That number shot up to over 50,000 by 2019. The number of people detained who did not commit felonies also rapidly escalated. Many of these people were children. This led to images such as this circulating on social media. Young children being kept in cages in poor living conditions. This made the rights of migrants a polarizing issue. Despite increased border enforcement and detentions and a drop in the number of migrants entering illegally, the number of informal migrants actually grew from 2000 to 2025. The reason why is that these policies did not only make it harder for migrants to enter the country informally, but it made it harder for migrants who came to the country formally to stay and renew their visas. The most common way of being in the country informally now is overstaying one's visa. This is shown in the data, as you can see on this slide. These policies have also created security challenges for informal migrants. Informal migrants who enter the country illegally more often have to take more dangerous paths to enter the country, since legal pathways to formal migration have been reduced and the safer routes for travel are more heavily securitized. Cases of human trafficking have increased as a result. While support for securitization of migration has increased in the United States and other developed countries, the supporters of multiculturalism did not disappear. In response to these growing challenges associated with migrant securitization, sanctuary cities and movements have emerged to protect vulnerable migrant communities. Sanctuary cities consist of local governments that purposely limit cooperation with federal authorities with the goal of protecting migrant communities. They also provide welfare and other services. They first emerged in the United States in the 1980s to protect asylum seekers coming from El Salvador, which had been ravaged by a civil war, a war made worse by the United States and the Soviet Union, who funded different sides in the conflict. The number of these sanctuary cities, though, grew rapidly in the 2000s as the securitization of migration intensified. They are normally found in so-called blue cities run by Democrats that have adopted these policies. There are a number of ways these sanctuary cities try to protect migrants. Some local police departments, for example, do not ask people about their migration status. One of the justifications for this is that local governments are worried that fears of deportation will lead to informal migrants not calling the police when they are the victim of a crime or a witness to a crime. Informal migrants are very vulnerable to criminality and exploitation when they cannot turn to the authorities for help, especially the victims of human trafficking. Some cities have also refused to detain informal migrants so they can be arrested. Some cities have also refused to detain informal migrants so that they can be arrested by ICE, which has created tension between many local governments and federal agencies in recent years. The justification for these policies is to also increase trust and cooperation between local police and migrant communities more generally. In New York, approximately 37% of the population consist of migrants. And such cooperation is critical for these cities to function. There are, of course, major drawbacks and criticism of these policies. Cities that institute these policies can experience a rapid influx of informal migrants seeking to obtain protection from deportation. Such rapid influxes constrain the resources of local governments as well as the infrastructure. This is a challenge that is currently facing New York City, for example. It could also encourage informal migration. It makes it easier for individuals to overstay their visas, for example, since they could seek protection from sanctuary cities. Other than sanctuary cities, sanctuary movements have also emerged to assist migrant communities. Movements consist of individuals and organizations outside the control of governments that mobilize and engage in collective action. Sanctuary movements specifically provide food, shelter, language and job training, and legal aid to asylum seekers, refugees, and informal migrants. These organizations are funded by a mix of wealthy left-wing patrons, such as the Ford Foundation, as well as small donations from local communities. There are hundreds of such organizations throughout the United States and other developed countries, such as France and other parts of the European Union. The organizations providing the aid consist of a mix of non-governmental organizations, international organizations like the UN Refugee Agency, and religious institutions such as churches and mosques. The last two popes of the Catholic Church have been particularly adamant about helping the plights of migrants throughout the world. In fact, Catholic churches are where the term sanctuary comes from. During the Middle Ages, many churches gave sanctuary to marginalized peoples fleeing from authorities. Churches still play a role in providing sanctuary to migrants today. In fact, when students traveling with Visit New York, they will be hosted by a church near Central Park in Manhattan. Some of these sanctuary movements have also become political. Many have engaged in protesting and media campaigns to promote migrant rights and to push back against securitization policies. This map demonstrates how widespread sanctuary cities have become in the United States. This is only showing the major sites. Major cities in the Northeast, the Midwest, the West Coast, and elsewhere have been engaged in activities to protect migrant communities. This includes New York City, which first became a sanctuary city in 1989 to assist asylum seekers from Central America and elsewhere. In New York, there are numerous social movements that have worked to provide assistance to migrants. The major organizations include the New York Immigration Coalition, Make the Road New York, and the Immigration Defense Project. But there are many others. You can learn more about these organizations on their websites. Numerous churches and other religious institutions are active across the city as well, provided to migrants. From this discussion, we now can fully understand more Trump's shift in public policy in his second term. A lot of changes have been made in 2025. Trump blamed many of his administration's difficulties on deporting migrants in his first term on the resistance of sanctuary cities. In Trump's second term, far more emphasis was placed on internal enforcement of migration policies over border security, and more draconian law enforcement efforts have been put in place to get around resistance from local authorities. To do this, the Trump administration in 2025 rapidly increased the number of ICE agents and their budget. The budget tripled for ICE, and tens of thousands of new ICE agents were hired in a short span of time. To rapidly hire these new ICE agents, qualifications for becoming an ICE agent were significantly reduced. College education used to be a standard requirement, but now many new hires lack a higher education. The vetting of new recruits has also been significantly reduced. There have been numerous reported cases of recruits being hired despite having criminal records, for example. Training time for ICE agents was reduced as well from 4 months to 6 weeks. The professional standards of the organization consequently declined significantly. The Trump administration also began to end cooperation with many local governments. He opted instead to send ICE agents into sanctuary cities without permission from local authorities or the support of local populations. The goal of these agents is to more actively enforce migration policies within cities on the ground to track down and detain as many informal migrants as possible. Intimidation is one of the tactics the agency is now employing. ICE agents have become far more heavily armed as they carry around assault rifles such as the M4. They also now wear heavily armored vests and masks to cover their faces. While the administration has justified these changes to protect the identities of ICE agents from reprisals by citizens, these policies have been criticized for creating a climate of fear and anxiety. Many individuals in sanctuary cities feel ICE is an occupational force. The use of heavy weaponry is also controversial. Informal migrants are mostly guilty of civil violations and misdemeanors, yet they are being treated like an insurgency. When law enforcement agents wear masks and are dressed for war, this can significantly decrease trust between these agents and local populations. ICE has found it difficult to obtain cooperation from local citizens and has been met with a lot of resistance as a result. Over the last year, ICE agents have also frequently violated the Fourth Amendment rights of both migrant and native-born citizens in these cities. Once again, this has been well documented by international human rights organizations. Many homes have been entered without warrants. The windows of cars have been smashed to pull people out of their vehicles by force. Many innocent citizens have been detained without reasonable reason to suspect that they have violated a law. Such aggressive policies have also generated significant opposition in these sanctuary cities. ICE agents have also relied extensively on racial profiling to determine who is the suspected informal migrant. Skin color, language, and other markers have been used by ICE agents. Of course, this is a significant problem given America's incredible diversity and the fact that we have citizens from many different parts of the world. For those informal migrants who are detained, many of them have been deported without trials to speed up the process of removing them from the country. Various emergency laws have been used to do this controversially. This is, according to many international human rights observers, a violation of the basic due process of individuals living on American soil. The securitization of migration in recent years has been tied, consequently, into a wider problem facing the United States and other developed democracies, which is the problem of democratic backsliding. Securitization of migration is not only targeted at informal migrants, but formal migrants. The hurdles for legal migration have increased recently. For example, there's now a more extensive vetting process before entering the country. Migrants now have to allow custom agents, for example, access to their social media profiles before they are allowed entrance to the country. This can take a while to inspect. There have been documented incidents of migrants being denied entry into the United States for being critical of the Trump administration's policies. There are also documented incidents of migrants being deported for taking stance on political issues that do not align with the Trump administration policies. Such issues include the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This represents a basic violation of First Amendment rights. According to the 14th Amendment, all individuals on American soil, whether they're migrants or citizens, are guaranteed basic civil liberties and political rights as outlined in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Many refugees already in the country illegally have already been stripped as well of their temporary status. As a result, many refugees have been forced from the country. There are also more stringent green card requirements that require higher fees. 39 countries have also been banned from immigrating to the country. This has led to a rapid drop in the number of formal migrants entering the country. Ironically, though, the amount of informal migration has actually increased because of these policies. While data has been harder to come by over the last year due to a drop in transparency from the Department of Homeland Security, let's look at some of the numbers that have been reported by international and domestic organizations. As you can see, the budget has massively increased for ICE. The United States is now spending approximately $30 billion on ICE and approximately $170 billion on migration enforcement overall. This massive increase took place as the budget of most other federal agencies have been slashed. This image here also reflects ICE's militarization and deprofessionalization. This contrast between 2003 and 2025 are quite drastic in nature and speak for themselves. On the left, we have individuals with basic flak jackets. They are not heavily armed. They're clearly identified as being ICE. They have their badges right around their necks. They're clearly identified. They are dressed like civilians. But the people on the right are heavily militarized. They're dressed like soldiers. In fact, they're wearing the camouflage. They're wearing masks over their faces. They are carrying, assault rifles and lots of other types of weaponry. They look intimidating. So the differences here are quite jarring. Now, on top of that, this militarization is also seen the administration sometimes sending the military into cities as well. And this is a problem for democratic backsliding. In democracies, militaries are supposed to be used for defense of the country. They're not supposed to be used for internal policing. So this has created a great number of challenges. Now, the number of ICE arrests, just to show you some of the numbers last year, have increased by over 600% under the Trump administration. But there are mixed reports in terms of the extent in which there's been a significant increase in deportations. Many of these arrests have been of civilians, and sanctuary cities have been putting up substantial resistance to ICE activities. The number of deportations, in contrast, have only most likely doubled. So despite the extensive amount of resources put into this, we've only doubled the amount of deportations. And believe it or not, those numbers only reached the high that took place under the Obama and Bush administration. Relative to the massive increase in budget that ICE has received and the rapid increase in the number of arrests, the number of deportations, okay, have fallen below expectations based on the amount of money that's been spent. The deportation of migrants has been anything but fiscally efficient. We have a lot of people getting arrested that are citizens, and a lot of people that being detained that won't end up being deported as a consequence. That's a lot of money wasted. These policies have also seriously exacerbated tensions within local communities. Major protest movements have broken out across sanctuary cities throughout the country, including New York City. Many protesters have been radicalized by recent events. The protests have led to clashes with ICE agents, with hundreds of injuries and several deaths in the process, as was recently witnessed with those shootings that became well politicized and covered by the media. What are we to conclude from all of this? Firstly, migration overall has been a net positive for America historically, despite the many challenges associated with it. While creating and enforcing immigration laws, it is critical that the United States does not discourage formal migration or create conditions where migrants who entered legally struggle to extend their visas. Over the last year, the number of formal migrants coming to the United States have plummeted. The number of informal migrants, quite ironically, have actually continued to increase as the Trump administration has made it even more difficult for formal migrants to renew their visas. Some preliminary evidence indicates that the deportations and drops in migration are already having also negative effects on the American economy. The price of food has gone up drastically, for example, due to the reduction in the agricultural labor force due to some according to some preliminary studies. So just in conclusion here, I would also like to add as well that there are also as well many other positive benefits of migration that we should not neglect. Migration historically has had a positive effect on American soft power. This idea that the American dream exists, that you come to this country, work hard, make your way up, and be successful. This has attracted a lot of migrants to the country. It helped America's reputation. It helped our economy in the long run, and it improved our alliances with other countries. What has happened in the last year is America's reputation has declined according to Pew polling. There is more antagonism towards the United States towards these policies. And as a consequence of this, this has hurt our soft power. We have to start changing our policies around. It is important to enforce migration laws, right? We can't just have completely open borders. Due to globalization, migration has intensified recently. There are a lot more people entering the United States than in the past. Okay, and at the same time, if you had open borders, this would lead to an influx of migration that would create way too much of a strain on our local infrastructure. We do have to regulate migration. There does need to be some securitization, but it has to be done in a way that follows the rule of law, that does not discourage formal migration, that treats both migrants and citizens as human beings and as citizens, that doesn't violate our basic civil liberties and political rights, and enforces those policies with empathy and respect for migrant communities. We also need as well to push back against cultural discrimination and against discrimination towards migrants specifically. The vast majority of these people, like regular everyday citizens, are just here trying to work, live their lives, and spend time with their families. So we have to push back against discriminatory treatment. Okay, so that does it for my lecture. I hope you guys got something out of this. I know that probably a few mistakes were in there. I even noticed I spelled the word Bering Strait long. There was a little typo in there. So, I know that sometimes mistakes get made. Feel free in the comments just to tell me what those mistakes were. I'll be sure to respond to them. And, this is a very sensitive issue. I know there are many differences of opinion. It's okay to have a difference of opinion as long as we express those with respect and decency towards our fellow human beings. So have a great day, guys.